Not because the pain ended, not because anyone had been saved. They stopped because the survivors made a choice, each one individually, without being ordered, without coordination, to convert the energy of panic into something useful. Hands that shook with pain still pulled survivors from debris. Voices that struggled to breathe still called out to assess who was alive, who was injured, what could be salvaged. People who could barely stand still moved. They shared oxygen canisters. They split their rations without being asked. They sealed hull breaches with their hands and bodies when tools weren't available. Captain Stone moved through the wreckage of the primary transport with a calm that was not coldness. It was something harder and more deliberate than coldness. He catalogued the situation with rapid precision. How many survivors? How much oxygen? How many hours until their emergency power cells expired? The numbers were not good. None of the numbers were good. He filed them away and kept moving. Night came to LX-491 Delta not as a slow dimming, but as a sudden collapse of light, as though the storms themselves had decided visibility was a luxury they would no longer permit. In the darkness, enormous shadows moved at the edges of sensor range. Something roared, a sound so low and vast it was felt in the sternum rather than heard with the ears. The ground shook in rhythmic intervals. In the alien monitoring station, Oshterin watched his sensor display with professional attention. Human life signs were scattered, disorganized, weakening. One by one, the individual signals began to disappear. "It's over," his assistant whispered. Oshterin said nothing. He kept watching. What he did not understand, what neither of them understood, what no species before humanity had ever demonstrated on a Class 15 world, was that the disappearing signals were not deaths. They were humans going underground. Digging in 2.3 gravity is extraordinary labor. The muscles scream. The spine compresses. Every shovelful of earth feels like 3. The tools they salvage from the wreckage, plasma cutters running on emergency reserve, structural boring equipment designed for mining operations, in some cases simple metal bars bent into makeshift picks, were not engineered for this gravity, this density of rock, this depth of survival need. They dug anyway. The tunnels came first in desperate, fragile sections, barely wide enough for a person to crawl through, barely stable enough to stand in. But humans are architectural creatures by instinct, and even in the worst conditions, engineering minds were already at work. Wider passages were reinforced with salvaged hull plating. Side chambers were carved for supplies, for the injured, for the scientists who immediately, within the first 36 hours, began trying to understand the world that was trying to kill them. The heavy gravity, they noticed, was making them stronger, not metaphorically, physically. The muscles that fighting against constant extraordinary weight were being subjected to the most intense resistance training in human history every moment of every day. It hurt in ways that ordinary exercise never does, in deep places that ordinary exercise never reaches. But the adaptation was beginning. Posture changed. Gaits shifted. Movement became more deliberate, more economical, stripped of wasted energy. Dr. Yua Tanaka, xenobiologist, one of the 11 who had stood calmly in the council chamber, set up what she generously called a laboratory in a carved-out side chamber 40 meters below the surface. Her equipment was improvised, damaged, and powered by a single emergency cell she rationed with obsessive care. But her mind was intact, and her curiosity, which had always been the most essential tool she possessed, was functioning at full capacity. "This world has rules," she told Stone during one of his rounds through the tunnels. She was examining a soil sample under a makeshift magnifier, her expression carrying the particular intensity of someone who has just found something genuinely interesting in the worst possible circumstances. Every environment has rules. The toxin composition in the upper atmosphere is consistent. That means predictable. The storm systems follow a pressure cycle. The creatures move on paths. Stone crouched beside her in the low-ceilinged chamber, listening. "Patterns," he said. "Patterns," she confirmed. "And rules can be learned." Above them, the death world continued its patient assault. Acid rain dissolved the upper layers of rock, sending minerals leaching down through the soil that the human scientists collected and catalogued with the urgency of people building an encyclopedia they might not live to finish. The megafauna moved overhead in cycles, and the vibrations of their passage became as familiar as weather, something to be tracked, anticipated, accommodated. The turning point with the creatures came on what the survivors had designated Day 11. A beast, smaller than the largest they had mapped, though still the size of a city block, found its way above their primary tunnel network. Something had attracted it, a sound, perhaps, or a vibration from their digging. It pressed down on the surface above with one limb, and the ceiling of a side chamber cracked, sending dust and small stones cascading onto the people inside. Panic was a heartbeat away. Stone felt it in the collective sharp intake of breath around him, felt it in his own chest, the primal animal terror of the earth above you becoming a weapon. He held up one hand. Complete silence. No one moved. No one breathed loudly. The beast pressed down again, cracking the ceiling further, and still no one made a sound. Children. There were 11 children in the surviving population, a detail that Stone never allowed himself to stop thinking about, were held against adults' chests with a firmness and care that compressed all of human parental instinct into a single wordless gesture. After what felt like a geological age, the beast moved on. The sound of its departure rumbled through the stone. When it had fully faded, Stone exhaled slowly and looked around at the pale, dust-covered faces surrounding him. "It hunts by sound," someone whispered. "Then we learned to be silent," Stone replied. That night, or what passed for night in a world where the sky never truly brightened, a small team of volunteers suited up in the most complete protective gear they could assemble from salvaged materials. They moved out onto the surface using the storm as acoustic cover, creeping through a world of fire and shadow with a focus so complete it had passed beyond fear into something almost meditative. They came back with soil samples, plant tissue, mineral fragments, and, most valuably, a section of shed claw material from one of the megafauna, 3 centimeters thick, harder than any engineered ceramic in their database, light enough to be workable. Dr. Tanaka held the claw fragment under her magnifier for a long time without speaking. When she finally looked up, there were tears in her eyes, not of grief, but of the particular emotion that scientists feel when the universe shows them something genuinely new. "We can use this," she said. In the alien monitoring station above the planet, Oshterran reviewed the latest data reports with growing unease. Human life signs had restabilized. More than that, their physiological readings were changing. Heart rates had slowed to calm, efficient rhythms. Muscle density readings were climbing. Reaction time measurements suggested neurological adaptation. He called his superior that cycle. "They are not dying," he said carefully. "They are changing." His superior told him to recalibrate his sensors. Oshterran recalibrated his sensors. The readings did not change. He sat alone in his monitoring station for a long time after that conversation, looking at the data, feeling the specific discomfort of a scientist whose professional certainties are being quietly removed. Time on LX-491 Delta had a texture unlike anything the survivors had experienced before. Back on Earth, back in the galaxy they had been cast out of, time moved in comfortable cycles. Morning and evening, weekdays and weekends. The human experience of time was built around rest and work in alternating rhythm. On the death world, there was only work and something that resembled sleep but was lighter and shorter and punctuated by the sounds of storms and creatures, always at the edge of awareness. But something strange happened to a people who lived without rest. They became extraordinarily efficient. By week 4, the tunnel network beneath the primary crash site had expanded to a complex of over 40 interconnected chambers. Smaller secondary networks branched outward from the center-like routes. Ventilation systems had been engineered from ship components and biological filtration. Certain native plants, Tanaka had discovered, metabolize the atmospheric toxins and produce a marginally breathable byproduct. The humans cultivated these plants with the devotion of people who understood that they were tending to their own lungs. The forges came next. Metalworking in the dark, in crushing gravity, with improvised equipment. It was brutal, grinding work that left hands scarred and joints aching in ways that didn't fully resolve even after sleep. But the alien metals they mined from the volcanic rock were extraordinary, denser than anything in human metallurgy, harder, and when combined with processed claw material from the megafauna, they produced a composite that laughed at the caustic atmosphere and shrugged off temperature extremes that would have destroyed conventional alloys. They made armor first, not the sleek, engineered armor of military tradition. There was no elegance in it. It was thick and layered and brutally functional, shaped to move with the body in high gravity, built in overlapping sections that accommodated the swollen musculature that every survivor was developing simply by existing in this environment. It looked like something grown rather than made. Then they made weapons. Captain Stone held the first blade they forged, a long, straight thing with a weight that would have been extraordinary in Earth gravity and felt perfect here, and understood something that he hadn't fully articulated to himself until that moment. "We are not surviving this world," he said to the assembled survivors in the largest chamber. His voice carried without effort. He had learned, as they all had, to project sound precisely without wasting it. "We are being made by it. There is a difference, and I need everyone to understand that difference." He looked at the blade in his hands, then at the faces around him, thinner than before, harder, marked by the experience of enduring something that was supposed to be unsurvivable. "When we leave this place," he continued, "we will not be what we were. We will be what this world required us to become." He paused. "That is not a tragedy. It is an answer." In the monitoring station, the data Osh-Terran filed was receiving high-level attention now. The Galactic Council had been monitoring through his instruments, expecting a tidy extinction event that would close the file on humanity. Instead, what they were reading was deeply, profoundly unsettling. Physiological metrics were not the metrics of a dying species. They were the metrics of a species in the process of violent optimization. "Send a drone," the Council liaison instructed. "We need visual confirmation of status." The drone entered the upper atmosphere on the 43rd day. It was a Velhari Deep Survey model, one of the most sophisticated autonomous monitoring platforms in Council technology, hardened against atmospheric interference, equipped with sensors capable of detecting life signs through 50 meters of solid rock, armed with a self-defense system that could neutralize most organic threats and more than a few mechanical ones. It had been deployed to death worlds before. It had always returned. Below the surface, they felt it before they saw it. Not through sensors. Those were still partially operational. But the drone was designed to mask its approach signature. They felt it through a different instrument entirely. Instinct. Honed over 43 days of learning to read a world that communicated in vibration and pressure, and the subtle wrongness of things that didn't belong. Stone was informed within seconds of the first human noticing the anomaly. He gathered a team in silence. No orders spoken above a whisper. No unnecessary movement. They positioned themselves around the most likely approach route, using the terrain the way the death world's own creatures use terrain, with patience and absolute stillness. The drone descended through the storm layer. Its sensors began scanning. The humans let it get close. Close enough that when they moved, there was no margin for the drone's defensive systems to respond. Cables made from processed plant fiber and alien metal, enormously strong, tested against megafauna now in ways that would have been unimaginable 2 months ago, wrapped around the drone chassis with coordinated precision. Blades drove into seams between armor plates. The drone's defense system discharged once, scorching the rock, before 3 successive cuts severed its power relay. It fell in sparking silence. The team stood over it in the flickering light of their extraction torches, catching their breath in the thin, filtered air. Then, one by one, they knelt and began to take it apart. Not randomly, systematically, with the methodical attention of people who had spent weeks studying an environment, learning its systems, reverse engineering its logic. Within 4 hours, they understood the drone sensor architecture, its power system, its communication array, and, most significantly, the encryption signature it broadcast back to the monitoring station. Stone stood looking at the disassembled machine for a long time. "They wanted us afraid," he said quietly, to no one in particular. "They wanted us weak." He looked up at the ceiling of rock above him, threw it by imagination to the storm in the sky and the vast indifferent galaxy beyond. "They sent us here so that this world would do what they didn't want to do themselves." He looked back at his people. It didn't. In the monitoring station, Osh-Terran waited for the drone's return signal. It never came. He filed an emergency report. The Council responded within the hour, demanding clarification. He had none to give. He simply transmitted the last data the drone had collected before its signal went dark, a sensor reading of multiple humans, moving in coordinated formation through the upper subsurface, displaying physiological and behavioral metrics entirely inconsistent with any known survival profile. The Council looked at the data for a long time. Then they dispatched a fleet. The fleet came with confidence. It came with a particular arrogance of power that has never been genuinely challenged, the kind that mistakes the absence of opposition for the absence of capability. 12 vessels, military grade, carrying a combined force that had pacified 4 rebellions in the past decade. Their orders from the Galactic Council were written in the clean, bureaucratic language of entities who believe they are correcting an administrative error. Sterilize the Class 15 designation. Confirm termination of exiled species. Close the file. From orbit, the planet looked the same as always. Impenetrable cloud cover. Continuous electrical discharge. No structures visible. No energy signatures breaking through the atmospheric interference. The fleet commander, Admiral Kuzvorin of the Thurian Compact, reviewed the sensor data with professional satisfaction. They didn't last, he said to his bridge crew. Longer than expected, but it's done. So, one of his officers said carefully, I'm getting fragmented life sign readings. They're inconsistent, but... Atmospheric interference, Kuzvorin said. It happens on Class 15 worlds. Proceed. The dropships enter the atmosphere. The moment they cross into the upper cloud layer, systems began to fail. Not catastrophically, not all at once, but in a particular cascading way that deeply engineered systems fail when something has gotten into the underlying architecture and quietly rearranged it. Guidance systems returned false positives. Weapon targeting arrays locked and would not unlock. Communication between dropship became intermittent, then unreliable, then silent. The drone communication encryption, it turned out, had been interesting to the human for reasons beyond intelligence value. They had spent 11 days learning exactly how to use it. The dropships touched down on a surface that looked empty. Black rock, storm-lashed terrain. No movement, no structures. The Thurian soldiers deployed with professional efficiency into a landscape that felt unsettlingly like a stage after performances ended but before the audiences left. Then the ground gave way. Not everywhere. Selectively, precisely, in the locations the soldiers had been channeled toward by subtle terrain features that didn't look designed because they had been made to look natural. 3 Thurian soldiers fell into prepared excavations before the rest realized what was happening. By then, the humans were already moving. They came up from the ground. That was a detail that the surviving soldiers would remember and struggle to articulate afterward. Not that they came from underground, but the way they came. Slow, controlled, without urgency or aggression or the emotional heat of combat. They rose from the rock of the death world like they had grown from it, wearing armor that looked organic rather than manufactured, moving in the 2.3 gravity that was destroying Thurian soldiers' joints and balance with the ease of people who had spent months being made stronger by exactly this weight. The first Thurian weapon fired on a human target. The composite armor turned it with a sound like a hammer on stone. The human in question paused, looked down at the scorch mark on their chest plate, and continued moving. What followed was not a battle. A battle implies 2 sides engaging in mutual violence across some period of time. What happened on the surface of LX-491 Delta was something more like a correction, swift, purposeful, and almost entirely one-directional. Thurian weapons could not penetrate the alien metal composite armor. Human blades could penetrate Thurian armor. The Thurian soldiers were struggling against the gravity. The humans were not. Thurian tactics assumed opponents who communicated with each other. The humans were so thoroughly silent and coordinated that their communication seemed to happen through something other than technology. Most importantly, the Thurian soldiers were afraid. They were afraid in the specific way that trained fighters become afraid when they encounter something their training did not prepare them for. The humans were not afraid. They had spent months beyond fear. Fear was something that happened in the first week on the Death World, and they had metabolized it into something else entirely, into the focused, quiet attention of beings who have learned to treat every moment as survivable until proven otherwise. From the bridge of his command vessel, Admiral Kuzvorin watched his dropship feeds with growing horror. He issued orders. The orders reached fragmented ears. He called for orbital support. The targeting systems returned error messages. Below him, Captain Stone had positioned himself on a ridge of black rock at the edge of clearing. Around him, the death world raged with its habitual violence. Storms churning, lightning splitting the dark sky, the distant subsonic roar of megafauna going about their incomprehensible business. He opened a broadcast channel, using the drone communication array, now thoroughly reproposed. "Admiral," he said. His voice was very calm. The translation array carried it cleanly to every Thurian vessel in the fleet. This is Captain Elias Stone of the human delegation. You were sent here to confirm our deaths." He paused. "We would like you to report back accurately." Silence on the channel. "This world was supposed to kill us," Stone continued. "The Council selected it for that purpose. What they did not account for," he looked out at the burning sky, and there might have been something almost like wonder in his expression, though it was a wonder of someone who was paid enormously for their knowledge and counts every piece of it as owned, was that we learn. We have always learned. From every environment, every adversary, every system that tried to reduce us. He turned his eyes back toward the command vessel's presumed location in the clouds above. "You built us a school, Admiral, and called it a grave. The error was understandable. The error will not be repeated." 3 Thurian vessels attempted to leave orbit. 2 of them made it. One found that its navigation had been subtly redirected while it was trying to stay focused on the surface situation. The remaining fleet broke formation. In the monitoring station, Osh-Terran was watching all of it. He had been watching for weeks with growing professional terror, building detailed reports that had been consistently dismissed or reframed by Council oversight as sense anomalies. He watched the Thurian fleet scatter, watched the human signals below move with coordinated precision through a Class 15 environment that should have been their tomb, and felt the specific cold clarity of a scientist who understands, fully and finally, that a paradigm has just ended. He began filing a different kind of report. The human ships left LX-491 Delta 4 to 7 days after the fleet engagement. They rose through the storm layer in formation, 14 vessels, 9 of which were modified Thurian dropships that had been repaired, restructured, and in several cases substantially improved by human engineers who had spent weeks studying them with the focused intensity of people who had nothing to do but learn. The other 5 were built, actually constructed, from Death World materials and salvage components, in underground facilities that had originally been simple survival shelters. The ships were not beautiful. That was the first thing the alien world saw when the sensor data came in. These were not the sleek, elegant vessels of a spacefaring civilization in its prime. They were thick and angular and scarred, layered with composite materials that the databases couldn't identify, designed with a brutal functionality that suggested every single design choice had been tested against survival need and everything decorative had been discarded. They looked, one Velhari journalist would later write, like the Death World had expelled them. The human warriors aboard them looked the same way. They had been transformed physically in ways that would take years for galactic scientists to fully document. Bone density increased by an average of 40%. Muscle fiber composition had shifted towards slow-twitch endurance structures. Neurological response times had shortened measurably. Their immune systems had been exposed to and adapted to atmospheric toxins that should have killed them in hours. And all of this was expressed in the way they moved, with a deliberateness and efficiency that registered, on a deep instinctive level, as different, not alien. Something worse than alien. Something that looked familiar and was not. The Galactic Council received Captain Stone's communication before the fleet reached any inhabited system. It was brief and it was courteous, and it was the most frightening message the Council had received in its 6,000-year history, not because of what it threatened but because of what it didn't. "We are returning," it said. "We have no interest in your destruction. We have a proposal. We would appreciate your willingness to listen." That was all. The empires that had voted to exile humanity convened emergency sessions. Defensive fleets were scrambled, then stood down when it became clear that standing them down was probably better strategically than presenting the returning humans with an obvious military target to evaluate. Political architectures that had been stable for centuries shifted overnight. Ambassadors who had once dismissed humanity as an upstart species to be managed were recalled for consultation. The word spread first through the informal networks, through traders and frontier world gossips, and the species whose cultural traditions prioritized information above almost everything else. Death World Forged. That was a phrase that moved through the galaxy, and with it, stories of soldiers who walked through toxic gas as though it were mild inconvenience, of commanders who never raised their voices, of a people who had been handed an ending and had handed it back, substantially modified. The Thurian soldiers who had survived the surface engagement were treated for their injuries and returned to their government. Their debriefs were classified at the highest level, but the contents leaked anyway. They always do. What the soldiers described was not the fury of a wrong species or the desperation of survivors. What they described was something closer to purpose. Calm, deep and apparently limitless. The empires that had supported the Exile Order sent delegations to meet the human fleet before it reached Council space. Each delegation expected negotiation from a position of human weakness. We will forgive what you've done if you give us this. We will forget the slight if you provide that. The human negotiators listened to each proposal with genuine attention, asked thoughtful questions, and uniformly declined. We don't need what you're offering, one negotiator told the Furian delegation, with a politeness that somehow made the word sharper. We would like, instead, to discuss what happens next. What happened next was shaped by what humanity had become on the death world: patient. They did not rush toward revenge. They did not accept the first frameworks offered. They moved through diplomatic space with the same deliberate economy they'd learned to use in LX-491 Delta's crushing gravity. No wasted movement, no unnecessary expenditure, every action purposeful. One by one, the empires that had raised their hands in that council chamber to condemn humanity found that their defenses were, by comparison, predictable. Their weapons were calibrated against species that had not spent months adapting to conditions that should have been lethal. Their tactics assumed opponents who were afraid of death, who would flinch at the right moment, who could be broken by sufficient application of force. Humanity had lost the capacity to be broken that way. The death world had found every breakable piece of them, and either destroyed it or reinforced it until it was stronger than before. "Stand down," Stone's voice said, again and again, across the communications channels of worlds that had expected a different species entirely. "We do not want your extinction. That is not what this is." It frightened them more than any threat could have. An angry enemy is comprehensible. An enemy who has been handed every reason for rage and has transformed it into something colder and more deliberate. That is something that ancient biological survival instincts have no adequate response to. The Galactic Council chamber had been prepared for the human delegation's arrival with what the Council considered appropriate ceremony. New seats had been installed on the floor level, properly scaled for human physiology. Refreshments were provided, human-compatible, a gesture of cultural consideration that was meant to signal goodwill. The translation arrays had been updated with the most current human linguistic data. Guards had been positioned at every entrance and then, after a long and uncomfortable internal debate, removed, because having guards present felt like an acknowledgement that they expected violence, and acknowledging that expectation felt inadvisable. The hall filled. Every available seat in the gallery was occupied. Species that had never before sent representation to a council session had dispatched observers. The audience was not there for justice. They were there because they understood they were about to witness something that would be discussed for the remainder of galactic history, and no one wanted to explain to their descendants that they had stayed home. The human delegation entered without escorts, without ceremony, without the kind of theatrical gravity that council proceedings usually demanded. 11 people in simple uniforms, the same 11 who had stood here before, plus 14 others who moved with the same death world economy. The scars on their uniforms from LX-491 Delta were visible because they had not been removed. Stone had considered that choice carefully. They were not symbols of suffering. They were records. Silence fell naturally, without the formal calls to order that usually open sessions. Stone walked to the center of the floor and stood there for a moment, looking at the curved bench where the 7 judges sat today. Some of the judges were the same as before. Some were not. One had resigned following the Furian fleet engagement, citing health reasons that everyone understood was something other than physical. Voss Krell remained, his ancient scale face unreadable, his eyes tracking Stone with the attention of an entity who understands that the situation has departed from any precedent. "High Arbiter," Stone said, not loudly. The room was so quiet that he didn't need volume. 6 months ago, you pronounced sentence on humanity. You sent us to a Class 15 world. He paused. "I want to begin by saying that we understand why." That was not what the chamber expected. A murmur moved through the gallery. "Humanity was loud," Stone continued. "We were expansionist. We made mistakes that disturbed other species. We were young by galactic standards, and we were not careful with that youth. The Council's concerns were not imaginary." He looked around the chamber, at the hundreds of alien faces, the familiar architecture of power that had determined their fate, the light falling through the same windows it had always fallen through. "We understand that. We have had a great deal of time to think about it." He let that settle. "But the sentence was not justice," he said, and his voice did not rise, did not harden, remained exactly the same measured calm it had been since he'd entered the room. The sentence was disposal. There is a difference, and the council knew it when they chose it. He looked at Voskrell. The Class 15 designation exists in your legal framework as an extraordinary measure for extraordinary circumstances. It has been used 17 times. Every species it was used against is extinct. You knew what you were doing, and you did it anyway. High Arbiter Voskrell said, very quietly, yes. The admission settled into the room like a stone into water. Ripples moved through the gallery. We did not return to punish you for that, Stone said. We return because the practice must end. He turned slightly, and on the screens embedded around the chamber, images began to appear, not of the fleet engagement or the survival beneath the surface. Those had already been thoroughly documented and distributed. These were different. These were human scientists cataloging the death world, children being taught in underground chambers by dim emergency light, hands building things from materials that had been attacking them the day before, a community in the middle of an extinction event, refusing to stop being community. We return to ensure that no species, no matter how young, how loud, how disruptive, how frightening to more established powers, is ever sentenced to one of these worlds again. He stepped back and nodded to one of the other delegates, who approached the bench with a document that had been prepared over the course of the journey back through council space. The amendment to the Class 15 statute was 17 pages long. It had been written by human legal scholars working from first principles, cross-reference against 6,000 years of galactic legal precedent that they had studied with a focused intensity of people who knew that their words would determine the shape of what came next. It was specific. It was comprehensive. It included enforcement mechanisms that were, unlike most galactic legal enforcement mechanisms, ones that humanity was now in a position to guarantee. The gallery watched the judges read it. One by one, votes appeared on the display above the bench. Green, green, green. All 7 were green before the final judge finished reading. The amendment passed. The practice of Class 15 exile was formally prohibited under council law, with retroactive notation that all previous such sentences had been entered into the permanent record as crimes against sapient life. A silence followed that was different from the silence at the beginning, less heavy. Something in it that was not quite relief but was adjacent to it, the particular stillness that follows a long-held breath finally, fully released. An alien judge, not Voskrell, but a younger member of the bench, from a species whose name translated roughly as the people of the Long River, spoke quietly into the silence. What will you do now? Stone turned toward the windows of the chamber. Beyond them, he could see a slice of the space station's outer ring, and beyond that, stars. He was quiet for a moment, looking at them, and anyone watching closely might have noticed that his expression in that unguarded second was not triumph or satisfaction, but something that was perhaps closest to grief, the grief of a person who has paid an enormous price for what they've gained and has decided, deliberately, not to pretend that the price was low. We will watch, he said. We will protect. He paused, and we will remember. The human ships departed the council station in the same quiet formation they had arrived in, with no ceremony and no fanfare. The observation decks of the station were crowded with beings of every species, watching them go. On LX-491 Delta, nothing changed. The storm still raged with their habitual violence. The acid rain still fell. The megafauna still walked their ancient paths across the surface. Their footfall still registered as seismic events. Their subsonic communication still carried across hundreds of kilometers of tortured landscape. The planet did not know what it had done. It did not know about the council chamber or the amendment or the fleet engagement or the stories that were now being told about it in every corner of the inhabited galaxy. It simply continued to be what it had always been, vast and indifferent and extraordinarily lethal. But on its surface, there were structures now. Not many, not elaborate, but the tunnel networks had been maintained, expanded by the small team of volunteers who had stayed behind by choice, scientists and engineers who understood that what they had found on this world was more valuable than anything a university laboratory could offer, and who had decided to keep learning. They walked the surface freely. They wore their composite armor not out of fear but out of habit and practicality. They had memorized the patrol routes of the megafauna and moved around them with the casual ease of people sharing a neighborhood with something enormous that they have simply learned to live beside. They were growing things now, in the deeper chambers, cultivating the filtration plants that had kept them breathing, developing agricultural techniques adapted to the crushing gravity in the toxic soil, writing papers that would take decades for the galactic academic community to fully process. Dr. Tanaka sent regular dispatches. They were written in the spare, precise language of someone who has learned to communicate only what is essential, and they described discoveries that were rewriting the galactic understanding of adaptive biology. She was, her colleagues agreed, doing the best work of her career in the worst conditions imaginable, and she showed no inclination to stop. Captain Stone visited once, 3 months after the council session. He came alone, in a small ship, and spent 2 weeks on the surface without specific purpose, just walking, in the gravity that still felt like home to his body now, in the storms that his lungs had learned to breathe, across the black volcanic rock that had broken him and reassembled him into something he hadn't known he could be. On the last night before his departure, he sat on a ridge above the entrance to the primary tunnel network and watched the lightning storm move across the horizon. The thunder was constant, rolling, immense. 3 megafauna moved in the distance, their silhouettes against the electrical sky like animate mountains. The air smelled of sulfur and ozone and something else, something he'd never been able to name, unique to this world, that had come to mean simply, "You are still here." He thought about the council chamber, about the green lights appearing one by one above the bench, about the human children who had learned their letters in dim underground chambers and were now in schools on stations and colony worlds throughout the galaxy, growing up with a story about their species that was true and terrible and, finally, complete. He thought about all the species that would never be sent to die in silence on a world that wasn't built for them. He thought about the ones who had already been lost. He sat with that for a long time, in the way the death world had taught him to sit with things, fully, without flinching, without rushing to convert the feeling into something easier. Then he stood, adjusted the weight of his coat against the gravity, and walked back to his ship. The storms continued behind him. They always would. The death world would go on being what it was, an engine of destruction that had no interest in any individual story, that had tried to end a species and had instead become the defining event of that species' history. Somewhere in the galaxy, a young diplomat from a civilization that had only recently achieved spaceflight was reading the account of what had happened on LX-491 Delta. She was reading it on a world where her species had lived in peace for 10,000 years, in a building with soft lighting and climate control, and air that tasted like nothing at all. She read to the end, and she sat for a while afterward without moving, and then she sent a message to her government. "The humans are watching," she wrote. "I think we should understand what that means." Across the stars, in the language of every species that had once laughed at the death sentence, the word had changed its shape. It no longer meant fragile. It no longer meant manageable. It no longer meant the thing that could be discarded when it became inconvenient. Human now meant something that every civilization in the galaxy understood in the part of their minds that is older than language and wiser than politics. It meant the thing that came back, the thing that learned, the thing that had been handed an ending and had quietly, in the dark, below the surface of a world designed to kill them, refused it. And in every corner of the inhabited galaxy, for the first time in the 6,000 years of council history, the species in power were beginning, slowly, with a particular discomfort of though confronting a truth they preferred not to face, to behave as though someone was watching. Because someone was. And they remembered everything. Never send a species where survival is impossible. They will survive. They will return. And they will be something the universe was not prepared to face. The Galactic Council hall had never been so quiet. It was a silence that pressed against the chest, heavy, deliberate, the kind that comes not from emptiness but from thousands of beings collectively holding their breath. Representatives from 412 species filled the tiered gallery, their eyes fixed on the 7 judges seated at the curved obsidian bench at the chamber's center. Bioluminescent markings flickered across alien skin. Feathers rustled. Tentacles curled with nervous energy. The lead judge, High Arbiter Voskrell, rose from his seat. He was ancient even by his species' standards, his gray-scaled hide etched with a record of 10,000 years of galactic lore. When he spoke, the translation arrays embedded in every wall carried his words simultaneously across dozens of languages. "Humanity is to be exiled," he announced, his voice flat and ceremonial, as though he were reading a grocery list rather than signing a death warrant, "to a Class 15 death world." A ripple moved through the chamber, not quite sound, not quite movement, but something in between. Every species present understood the weight of those words. Class 15 worlds were not prisons. They were not punishments in any meaningful sense of the word. They were graves with atmospheres. In the 6,000 years since the Galactic Council had catalogued such places, not a single intelligent species had survived on one for more than 72 hours. Sending a species there wasn't justice. It was an execution dressed in legal language. The gallery expected the humans to break. They did not. The human delegation stood together on the floor of the chamber, 11 men and women in simple gray uniforms, their hands folded behind their backs with a kind of stillness that comes not from acceptance but from absolute, unshakable resolve. No tears, no outbursts, no desperate pleading or appeals to mercy they clearly understood would not be granted. Just 11 pairs of eyes looking calmly forward, as though they had already anticipated this moment and had long since made their peace with it. Captain Elias Stone stepped forward from the group. He was not a large man by human standards, medium height, broad-shouldered, with a kind of face that had been weathered by years of hard decisions rather than hard weather. A faded scar ran along his left jaw. His dark eyes were steady. "You are sending us to die," he said simply. High Arbiter Voskrell met his gaze. "The sentence has been determined." Stone nodded once, as though that confirmed something he had already known. He looked slowly around the chamber, at the hundred of alien faces watching him, at the judges who would not meet his eyes, at the gallery where some species had turned away entirely. Then he turned back to his people, said something too quiet for the translation arrays to catch, and stepped back into line. It was a restraint that disturbed the chamber most. An alien diplomat from the Frenosi Collective later admitted that a single human sob would have made the whole thing feel tidier. Instead, the silence that came from the human delegation felt like a door being closed, not slammed, not locked, simply shut with quiet and total finality. 20 minutes later, human transport ships were herded through a violent warp gate at the edge of Council-controlled space. The passage tore at the ship's hulls. Emergency alarms screamed inside every vessel. And on the other side, waiting for them like a patient predator, was a world that was meant to be their tomb. It had no official name in any human database. The Council catalog simply listed it as LX491 Delta with a Class 15 designation and a short advisory notice, no recovery operations authorized. From orbit, if you could even call it a stable orbit in the gravitational chaos surrounding the planet, it looked like a bruise. Vast storm systems churned across 90% of the surface, lit from within by constant electrical discharge. The upper atmosphere was a cocktail of ammonia, sulfuric acid, and compounds that had no names in human chemistry. Gravity registered at 2.3 times Earth standard. Surface temperature fluctuated between extremes that could freeze hydraulic fluid and melt standard-grade titanium within the same hour. And the creatures, even through sensor feeds taken from what was considered a safe observation distance, they were staggering, continent-crossing megafauna that moved across the Hell's Cape like living geological events. Some were kilometers long. Their footfalls triggered seismic readings. They communicated in subsonic frequencies that could liquefy unprotected tissue at close range. They were not predatory in any conventional sense. They simply moved, and whatever was in their path ceased to exist. An alien observer stationed in the monitoring post above the planet, a Velhari scientist named Oshterin, who had spent 40 years cataloging death worlds, watched the human ships breach the atmosphere on his sensor array. He had seen 17 species sent to Class 15 worlds over the course of his career. He had learned to maintain professional detachment. 3 days, he said to his assistant, his translator rendering the Velhari clicks into standard galactic. "I am being generous." His assistant, younger and more openly gleeful about the whole affair, simply laughed. The human ships did not enter the atmosphere gracefully. The storm systems caught them almost immediately, tearing at stabilizers and shredding communication arrays. 3 vessels broke apart entirely before reaching the surface. The remaining ships came down hard, not landing so much as controlled disasters, gouging trenches across a landscape of black volcanic rock and writhing toxic vegetation. The gravity hit the survivors like a physical blow the moment they stepped out of the wreckage. It was not simply weight. It was a pressure that settled into every joint and muscle simultaneously, as though the planet itself were trying to compress each human being into a smaller, more manageable size. Soldiers who had trained in Earth-standard gravity found themselves dropping to their knees within seconds of exposure. Every breath came harder than the last. The air, even through emergency respirators, carried something caustic that found its way past seals and into lungs, burning with a low, persistent intensity. Screams echoed across the wreckage sites. Then they stopped,